Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to IDAGIO Live, the place where classical music happens. And I'm happy to be a part of a new series of conversations about music you can discover, the great discography that we have in classical music that is truly a treasure. And my idea is to look and listen and discuss together about the recorded treasures, particularly concentrating on keyboard music. My name is Kirill Gerstein and I'm a pianist. And I've always felt that teachers are to be experienced in person, of course, but we have also a great library of teachers as musicians and particularly as pianists. In the past 120 years of great minds and fingers and spirits going into the studio and committing very intimate thoughts in front of the microphone. And I thought to begin our discussions, which, by the way, will be hosted by me regularly every Monday at the same time at 7 p.m. Standard Europe time. And I thought today to look at what is really one of the cornerstones of our repertoire as keyboard players and one of the treasures of our art form. And that is the well-tempered clavier of Johann Sebastian Bach. And there's a wonderful quote by Hans von Bülow, an important conductor pianist in mid-19th century, student of Liszt. And Hans von Bülow said, "The well-tempered clavier is the Old Testament. Beethoven's sonatas are the new. We must believe in both." And the person that I would like to turn your attention to first as an interpreter of these pieces, and I think perhaps the earliest, if not certainly one of the earliest, but maybe the earliest recording of a prelude and fugue by Bach from the well-tempered clavier. And that one is made by Ferruccio Busoni in 1922, the great Italian composer, pianist, visionary, philosopher of music, really a key figure of 19th and 20th century music, and of course a very significant composer himself. He, in fact, was one of the people that brought the well-tempered clavier further to the fore in late 19th century and beginning of 20th century. Busoni didn't believe in recordings. He said it is a devilish invention, but lacking the devilish spirit. Yet I think we can be very grateful that he went into the studio in 1922, and among the few tracks he recorded as acoustic recordings, he recorded the first Prelude and Fugue in C major. Actually, the most striking miss or near miss of a recording industry foresight is that Busoni, despite his skepticism about this new medium of recording, offered Columbia Records to record the complete well-tempered clavier of Bach, all 48 preludes and fugues, and was turned down because this, quote, had no commercial interest to the company. So that one we can only lament over, but we do have the first C major prelude and fugue, and the wonderful technology here allows me to actually play a bit of the recording for you. Of course, later I hope you will explore the various recordings of the well-tempered clavier on IDAGIO or elsewhere. I'm not going into the ones that are perhaps the well-known one and lie on the surface, but that is not a comment on their quality, but wanted to turn your attention to ones that perhaps are slightly under the radar for some of you. So here's Busoni playing, and we'll start with just an excerpt of the fugue. And I'll stop at one of the waypoints in the piece where I find through Busoni's performance, the music breathes out and lays a significant way mark in the road of this piece, and perhaps comment about it later. So here's Ferruccio Busoni in 1922 playing the fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier in C major from the first volume. So there you have it. The remainder is hopefully for you to listen and enjoy. You have to get past the surface noise on these old recordings, but I think the ear does that quite quickly. But then it's astounding that you can still hear the hazy glow of the pedal resonance that I think I wouldn't call romantic, as sometimes called, but it gives a certain feeling of acoustic to the instrument and to the sound, and Busoni was renowned for that. And so Busoni, born in 1866, recording this in 1922, recording in 1922 a piece that was composed in 1722. And the next one I wanted to mention today is the recording by Edwin Fischer, the great Swiss pianist, born 20 years later after Busoni in 1886. And he was the first one to make a complete recording of the Well-Tempered Clavier. There were a couple attempts earlier in the 20s, but in 1930s, Edwin Fischer records the complete Well-Tempered Clavier for the first time. And it's also interesting to think how the discography and the recordings that are made serve almost as a genealogical tree to later thought about these pieces. And for example, Andras Schiff, who has two wonderful recordings of the Well-Tempered Clavier that I'm sure you know and have heard. Andras mentions the influence and a certain feeling of relatedness to the Fischer cycle. So does Daniel Barenboim, another wonderful musician that has a significant recording of the Well-Tempered Clavier. So there are certain recordings that stem as a continuation from let's say common sources. And Edwin Fischer himself was not a student, but one could say a disciple of Busoni, and was very influenced by Busoni's idea on Bach. However, Fischer is perhaps to our ear sounds more straightforward, and sometimes an interesting comparison is made that, well, Fischer was said to have been a very spiritual, very sincere man, tending towards simplicity, but also it's fascinating to think that he was influenced by the Bauhaus in the important design and architectural movement is starting in 1919 and in the 1920s. And the idea of this next Bach recording, an excerpt which I'll play for you, that is more Bauhaus than Gothic, or more Bauhaus than the Gothic idea as represented by the 19th century, early 20th century, the way perhaps Busoni comes across to you. And let's continue with the fugue, if I can get the approximately the same place, and hear a little bit of Edwin Fischer. So there you have it. It's about 15 years later than the Busoni recording, recorded by somebody that knew Busoni, 20 years his junior, and the aesthetics have changed. And of course here, unlike the first recording I played with Edwin Fischer, you can in fact experience all of the Well-Tempered Clavier, which is a wonderful recording that wears very well, since we're here 90 years after it's been made, and it still seems fresh and relevant, and the lack of affectation is perhaps one of the things that makes it wear well. And I thought to continue this very brief jumping around the Well-Tempered Clavier discography with Rosalind Turek, of course, a Bach pianist that comes to mind mid-20th century is Glenn Gould. And that is one of the reasons why I didn't select his recording today, because you know it anyway. But the playing of Bach by Rosalind Turek was something that actually influenced Glenn Gould. He admitted himself that she was a major influence on him. And there is a nice quote where he says, "She was the first person who played Bach in what seemed to me a sensible way, was playing of such uprightness to put it into the moral sphere." And Turek, of course, was known for playing most of Bach's keyboard works. And she herself was influenced by Wanda Landowska, who also has a very important recording of the Well-Tempered Clavier, but perhaps hers is more known than Turek's, at least to some. And Rosalind Turek is born in 1913, just out of curiosity, to keep mentioning the birth date. So we had 1866, 1886. Turek is born in 1913 and lived till 2003. There is a excellent and striking recording of the Goldberg variations that she did for Deutsche Grammophon quite at the end of her life, remaining in incredible shape and with incredible control of polyphony and incredible conviction of how Bach should go, and that she shared with Wanda Landowska. Incidentally, Wanda Landowska was turned to the harpsichord partly by Busoni's advice, who heard her play the piano and said, "I think your future is with the harpsichord." And that was a turning point in Landowska's career, and that changed much of Bach's interpretation and the thought on Bach's keyboard works in the 20th century. So since we heard two times an excerpt of the fugue, let's hear an excerpt of the prelude with Rosalind Turek. So I'll stop here and you'll hear the rest by yourself. I think you see what it means that this is playing of such uprightness as to put it into the moral sphere. And I think there's all the time in the world that this music needs to take, in Turek's opinion, and does take. And it's like tuning into a different different wavelength from the previous recordings that we heard, but I think important and excellent in its own way. And the last one for today, I wanted to play at least one and discuss one recording that's on the harpsichord. Of course, there are many recordings that you can turn to. Ton Koopmans comes to mind, and many more recent ones. But I wanted to play one by Zuzana Růžičková, who was a Czech harpsichordist, born in 1927, and she passed away in 2017. I had the fortune to and the privilege to still meet her a few times in Prague, and this was a human being with real inner glow and humanity. She had an incredible life path and a very difficult one. She experienced not one, not two, but at least 3 of the Nazi concentration camps. She worked in a military factory as a slave laborer and was liberated in April 1945, returned to the Czech Republic, then as a Jewish musician, suffered during the communist rule, and throughout it all played Bach beautifully, touchingly. She became the first person to record all of the keyboard works of Bach, and those recordings are very important. And if you have a chance, seek out the movie about her life called Zuzana, Music is Life, and tells her story in a very moving way. So I thought today to finish with her performance, and I'll play again the prelude of the first well-tempered clavier prelude and fugue in C major. So, always best to finish with some music. This was Zuzana Růžičková playing the prelude from the first Prelude and Fugue, Well-Tempered Clavier Volume 1, by Johann Sebastian Bach, and I thought to start this series on Adagio Live called View Across the Keyboard with a cornerstone of our repertoire and Western culture. And I hope you'll join me next week here on Adagio Live, and we'll look at some other piece that has perhaps recordings waiting to be discovered amidst the thickness of riches that we have in our catalog and now at our fingertips. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Kirill Gerstein, and send your questions, and see you next week.